Recording in progress.
I call the study session of the City of Ashland Planning Commission to order for April 28th, 2026. I'll note that our meetings are available on Zoom and RVTV. The public can find information on how to participate in Planning Commission meetings in our public notices, as well as directions on how to find the full meeting materials, applications, and staff reports. I note that we do have we have 5 of 7 members present, so we do have a quorum. Brandon, do you have any announcements for us?
I would note that the city is undertaking its strategic planning effort, and if listeners at home or commissioners would want to fill out a community survey and go to ashland.or.us or ashlandoregon.gov/strategic plan, there's a link to a community survey that they're collecting information from March through the beginning of June, and then we'll synthesize that information in June. So now's the time to fill it out. That's all I have.
Okay. Public forum. I see Mr. Rhodey is here, but he's going to speak on an item that's on the agenda. So anybody else want to talk to us? I guess not. Okay, we'll move on. Discussion items. We are here to hear from Brandon and Derek and Linda about discussion on the manufactured park zone MHPZ amendments. And what they're looking for from us is our comments that they will incorporate back into the final published version that we will have the public hearing on in May. Go for it, Brandon.
Thank you, Chair Werner. So as you are all familiar, you had a study session, a joint study session with the City Council to address the development of the manufactured home park zone, as well as look at the development standards within manufactured home parks. This is a project that was identified in the housing production strategy as a priority objective to retain manufactured home parks within our community. So in terms of the background of the project, as I mentioned, it's part of the HPS. So it is one of the strategic actions that we've identified will be completed over the next 8-year period, and this being in the first year of that 8-year period. We were fortunate to receive assistance from the Department of Land Conservation and Development in order to get consultant services to assist in this project. 3J Consulting has provided quite a bit of the work in developing the ordinance and participating in both the study sessions that you're familiar with, as well as the formation of a manufactured home park management advisory committee. And we held a number of meetings with that group to get input for the development of the ordinance. I will note that Scott Freganesi and Journey have been working on this project, and unfortunately Scott was unable to attend this evening, but we will definitely be providing him all the information that you provide. This being a study session, the intention is to get your review of the ordinance and provide recommendations back for staff to incorporate into a final draft ordinance, potentially 3 ordinances, one for the establishment of the land use code, one to modify the zoning map to establish a manufactured home park zone, and one to modify the comprehensive plan map to identify that zone for future annexations of manufactured home parks that are not currently within the city. In terms of the ordinance developing the land use component, those are ordinances and ordinance amendments that establish standards for density, lot size, setbacks, and really in an interest to preserve those existing parks and also allow for other manufactured housing unit types that are now required under state law, that within manufactured home parks you have to allow for prefab units as well as RVs. So our draft code would incorporate those allowances to have additional unit types. So I think, I mentioned some of this, but one of the recognitions in doing the housing production strategy was that manufactured home parks form an opportunity for entry-level home ownership. And so that was a housing type that was looked to be specifically at risk of redevelopment in these existing zones. We have not seen, in the last decade anyway, a manufactured home park close, but prior to that, a number of manufactured home parks did close and displaced the residents in those communities were displaced. And so part of this is to preserve that existing housing within our community. And that brings us to the project scope. Started with the code audit, looking at the existing code and developing code concepts. Subsequent to that, we had study sessions with this body as well as Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee and City Council to draft code amendments. And we're at you this evening with what are essentially final code amendments. However, we do recognize that input that you provide tonight could be assist in modifying the code before it comes back at a public hearing scheduled for, and correct me if I'm wrong, May 26th before this body. And that May 26th meeting would be a public hearing for the formal adoption of this. We're preparing to send notice about that meeting to all the property park owners as well as residents within those communities so that they have an opportunity to participate in those public hearings. So with that, I wanted to walk through what existing manufactured parks we have in town. We handed out a map this evening for you that delineates 7 parks that would be affected by the modification of the ordinance and the change in zoning and comprehensive plan. I would note that 3 of those are outside the city limits currently, and so these modifications would have no current effect on them as they are within Jackson County's jurisdiction, but they are within our urban growth boundary, so upon annexing into the city, these standards would apply. So the first park is outside the city limits is Jackson Wellsprings. It's got 16 existing units on that property. Also outside the city limits is the Nauvoo Park Estates, which has 42 units, and these are on the north side of Highway 99 as you come into town from the north. Also, there is a park up on Idaho Street, 270 Idaho Street, which has 28 units, and I say mixed units because a number of those are either prefab structures or stick-built, but there are also a number of recreational vehicles that are used as permanent dwellings on that property. Then on Tolman Creek Road, there are 38 units in the Tolman Creek Manufactured Home Park, and that's on 6.6 acres of land. And that is, I think, unique in the parks in that it's zoned single-family R1 3.5. The park that most are familiar with is Wingspread Park, which is the largest park within Ashland at over 20 acres and about 116 units. That property is currently zoned R2. We also have on Siskiyou Village Park, which is outside the city limits off of Croson Road. That park does have 49 units and again is adjacent to the city limits and in the urban growth boundary, so it would require annexation in order to come into the city. And the Upper Pines mobile or manufactured home park is located behind Remix on Siskiyou Boulevard, or between Siskiyou Boulevard and Highway 66. That project has 51 units, two commercial buildings in the front along Ashland Street, and 1 small commercial building on Siskiyou Boulevard. And this property is zone C1, so commercial. And I'd also note that it's within the climate-friendly area, which you're familiar with through our recent adoption of that new zoning overlay. So the consultants and the Management Advisory Committee and the study sessions before the committees and commissions looked at various case studies where manufactured home park zone ordinances have been developed There are not that many of them. The consultant was able to identify 3. Portland, Oregon, one that you may be familiar with. Also, Bellingham, Washington had some provisions that related to protections for park residents to form a resident-owned communities, and Fort Collins, Colorado. So these case studies were all examples that did address manufactured home, and in a number of those, such as the city of Portland, they proposed increases in residential density. I believe they had 52 manufactured home parks within the city, and in drafting a manufactured housing park zone, 51 of the 52 elected to participate in that. 1 did not, and as such, the city of Portland did not extend the zone to include that property. But the case studies were really a base point for the city to look at what we needed to consider. Additionally, we looked at recent changes in state legislation relating to manufactured homes on single family properties, and embedded in the code presented to you this evening, code modifications in order to treat manufactured dwellings the same way that we treat single family homes. For instance, a single family home is not required to have a carport or a garage. We don't stipulate issues on material choice, roof pitch, and so those provisions in our existing code, in order to comply with state law and really to treat manufactured homes in the same capacity, have been removed from the draft ordinance before you. And as I mentioned, Bellingham focusing on the tenant rights and creating strict land use controls through their overlay and a sale notification process. That assisted us in developing a model, and also talking with the CASA resident-owned communities as to the difficulty that they have in terms of creating a resident-owned community with a short timeline, afforded a 30-day period in which the resident-owned community would have to form and make an offer to purchase the property. So we have proposed extending that to a 120-day period to afford that opportunity. And with that, I unfortunately did not participate in the stakeholder interviews. This was consultant driven. So they held a number of interviews with park owners and to try and determine what their concerns were. Derek can also probably weigh in on this, but my understanding is a number cited concerns with if they had to do a minor improvement to the park, that it would trigger a wholesale improvement to the park in order to comply with current standards. There was also concern raised in terms of the zoning code application, general concern over a new zoning code that might limit the potential uses on their property. But as part of those themes, wanting to look at increased flexibility for non-conforming sites. So in circumstances where the setbacks on an existing park weren't met, if we did change the zoning code to increase densities, for instance, and they went to add a unit, they were concerned that the imposition of the new standards would mean that they retroactively had to address all the existing nonconformities in the site. And so one of the proposals before you this evening is to establish a conditional use by which the city could consider the impacts of the proposed expansion of a park against the nonconformities in place, and really provide a hardship exception so that those parks could persist without having to come 100% into compliance. So as I've touched on, the setbacks or the code audit looked at things like the density and lot standards, setbacks, and landscaping and open space. Additionally, we looked at the nonconformity and redevelopment of nonconforming lots, and use and design flexibility. And this one is really new in our manufactured home parks, is really looking at the allowance to provide for residents serving commercial uses within a park. And those include daycare, an office, a coffee shop, a clubhouse for the residents. Currently, the ordinance is structured because they're residentially zoned. Those would not be allowable uses with the exception of the C1 zone manufactured park. But providing that limited non-residential community serving use was seen as a way to incorporate community serving uses within a park. Daycare being the clearest example of one that would benefit park residents. And I would note that although there is not a limitation on who could use these potential uses, there would be a limitation on size of 2,500 square feet of floor area plus 100 square foot per unit within the park. Part of that might be an opportunity for on-site storage for residents only, those kind of things that could not be accommodated under our current code. And lastly, that tenant affordability and protection. I say lastly, but I think that is a major component of the proposed changes. So again, the recommendations and overview that they provided, I'm going to go into those in a little bit more detail here in a second, but there's a list of them. So really looking at units on individual lots. And so I should separate, this is for a manufactured home located on a vacant parcel, not within a manufactured home park. So in the case there's a vacant parcel in this city, we currently have requirements that you have to use skirting such as wood. And that was seen as, and as something that doesn't apply to single family homes. So the audit recommendation was to really look at building code requirements and encourage ignition resistant materials. And so, for instance, we're looking at, actually this is not individual lots. These are some of the code requirements that relate to within a park. We looked at the setback between units. I think it's currently 5-foot setback between manufactured units within a park. In looking at the concern with fire, we wanted to ensure that the separation met fire and building code requirements and encouraged ignition-resistant materials, such as metal skirting being encouraged, whereas currently that's prohibited in our code. So within a park, currently the code allows for 8 units per acre and envisions a 200 or 2,000 square foot space. It says minimum lot, but again, we're talking not individual lots of record, but a space for the individual manufactured unit, and delineates that as 35 feet wide, 40 feet deep, with a 10-foot front setback and 5-foot side setbacks. So again, it's really modeling it after single-family lots within a subdivision. The proposed recommendation through the audit was to increase that to 18 units per acre and remove the individual space width and depth minimums and rely on the building code for separation. I would note that the 18 units per acre really gets to the current zoning density of the R1 3.5, or I'm sorry, R2 zone for wing spread is 13.5 units per acre. And then when density bonuses are applied for affordable housing or conservation, you get up to 18 units per acre. So again, in terms of looking at these parks and not wanting to, wanting to encourage the opportunity for needed housing units, that was the recommendation through the audit and is the recommendation in the code update that's presented to you this evening. Also looking at removing those minimum interior setbacks, but maintaining the perimeter setbacks from the park to the adjacent properties on all sides. The manufactured home park design standards, and I apologize for the font size. Currently, the existing code, depending on what zone it's in, requires either 35 or 45% of the lot be landscaped, and that would be the full parent parcel. And I should note that landscaping, that in our code, we're looking at a distinction between lot coverage and areas that are landscaped. So where you're in an R2 zone, 65% lot coverage, 35% landscaping. And lot coverage includes all impervious surface such as sidewalks, driveways, the footprints of the buildings themselves. Decks also count towards that, anywhere where water wouldn't infiltrate naturally into the ground. So in looking at that landscaping requirement, if we're establishing a new zone, I mentioned before, Some properties are zoned R1 3.5, some are zoned R2 currently. Creating a new zone, the recommendation in the code update was to look at 50% of the unbuilt landscaped area, or unbuilt area to be landscaped and 5% common open space. Staff's recommendation, which differs from what's in the documentation presented to you this evening, would really to be looking at that consistency with the R2 zoning code and allow for 65% lot coverage and 35% landscaping, again, matching that current standard. And also to note that all landscaping has to comply with the wildfire safety standards, and also retain that 5% common open space requirement as recommended in the code update. Then in terms of unit sizes, the current code requires a 650 square foot minimum unit size with a 12-foot width and requires a patio or a deck be included. It was noted at the Housing and Human Services, at the joint study session with the council in this body, that there's a variety of unit types that would provide for manufactured housing that are not meeting those requirements. For instance, there are new models that within the footprint of one manufactured home unit that typically would have been 1,000 square foot unit, for instance, is developed as an internal duplex. And so we wanted to create opportunities for those kind of prefab units by removing those restrictive requirements. So the audit recommended reducing to a 500 square foot minimum and allowing 2 small units per lot or space. And the interest in modular prefab units also came up, but in terms of the code update, in order to provide that flexibility and remove that concern, we're actually noting that no square foot minimum be required. Again, this is an area for your consideration. And also that units less than 500 square feet are considered half a unit. Currently, elsewhere in our code, units less than 500 square feet are considered 3/4 of a unit for the purposes of calculating density, so that we may look at aligning those for consistency across the board. But again, this would create also opportunities for manufactured dwellings, prefabs, and RVs. It was interesting in looking at the existing parks around the community, and I'm not sure if you've had opportunities to drive through and do site visits, but as manufactured home units are removed, often RVs are what replace them. And so again, with the new state legislation requiring their inclusion, it also makes sense to reduce that 650 square foot minimum, because there would be a conflict in many RVs on that standard alone. So non-conforming developments, again, I probably touched on this already, enlarging or remodeling existing manufactured home parks would be permitted. There's limited flexibility through the conditional use permit process now. So through this review, we looked at opportunities to create that hardship consideration, allow for phased compliance. As you know, if the park expanded by 10%, perhaps the commission could consider through a CUP process bringing the site into 10% compliance as opposed to 100% compliance and changing driveway widths throughout the development. We did want to incorporate criteria in the draft code, one of which I'll note after talking with the fire marshal subsequent to the last joint study session was the need to have fire apparatus access and egress. And so having a criteria that a hardship variance to expand without fully addressing all those nonconformities should still address fire access and apparatus staging area. So in my example of a driveway that might not meet current standards or those proposed in the ordinance, there may be an opportunity for a park to create a fire work stage area within a section of the park that satisfied their ability to get in and stage their firefighting. So with that, I'm going to move on to the section about the notice of sale and resident-owned communities. So again, the property rights and transactions under ORS 90 do have requirements, and that's existing requirements for park owners to provide notification to residents if they're going to sell or close a park. And again, that 30-day notice period was found to be insufficient to create a resident-owned community response to that notice. So that concern prompted the consultants and staff to work up a alternative 120-day timeline, and therefore provide an opportunity for the residents to meet with ROC representatives and form a ROC, and a resident-owned community. Additionally, as part of this, outside of the land use code, it was seen as a valuable undertaking as education and outreach, perhaps housing and human services, to reach out to those resident communities and make them familiar with what, or residents of manufactured home parks, and make them familiar with what a resident-owned community is. We're talking about forming it at the point of sale, but there is no prohibition against getting ahead of the game and forming one early. But providing a mandated window that does provide at least the opportunity. It also incorporates that the city would receive notice and also have anti-harassment provisions. I don't think any of these, with the exception of Commissioner Concarin, were on the Planning Commission when we adopted the condominium conversion ordinance that really addressed a conversion of apartments into for ownership housing units. And in that ordinance, which is now part of our code, we did establish some tenant rights, notification, anti-harassment policies that were looked at to model this new section of code after. And so then as part of code cleanup, we also looked at the existing code states that manufactured home parks, new parks, shall be processed under the performance standards option. But when you go to that section, it doesn't reference them or provide any guidance. And so this did want to include manufactured home parks by reference to make it consistent. Additionally, looking at that section, and we brought this up at a prior study session of this body, that performance standards option is triggered, or a outline plan and final plan for the survey work is required if you develop 10 or more lots. The concern was raised at the prior study session that cottage housing units of 12 units could be processed, but would require an outline and final plan. Taking that opportunity of revising this section of code to newly include manufactured homes as manufactured home parks as not requiring final and outline plan if it's done as a park. We also looked at making a modification to say, and cottage housing are also allowed by that without having to go through that two-step process. So I just wanted to point that out as something that's a little distinct from the manufactured home park ordinance, but an opportunity to do a little house cleaning there. So those standards are now referenced in 18.2.3.180. So then it came up at the joint study session with council and this body that we currently require any new annexation to provide 25% affordability and 90% minimum density for annexations. In considering that, it was seen that that could discourage annexation of those parks that are outside our city limits, but within the urban growth boundary. And in recognizing that those parks provide a needed housing type, the code update presented before you would exempt the annexation of a manufactured home park from the 25% affordability requirement, or being required to meet the minimum density because it may only have been developed at 9 units per acre as opposed to 18. So those provisions are to really encourage those annexations, which may be necessary for those parks if they need city services, water, sewer. And so the other aspect of that annexation of an existing park that was a consideration was if that park was annexing and wanting to expand the number of units. and they were required an affordable housing component, the question would be posed of their development, which units would have to become affordable. And as these are often owner-occupied dwellings, it does pose some difficulties in terms of how to structure that. So in order to encourage their annexation, they have been exempted from that requirement in the draft code before you. So, and now we're on to the next steps. So this is an opportunity again for the commission, and I think members of the public that might present to have another opportunity to provide feedback before a final draft ordinance is prepared and reviewed and brought back to you at your May 26th hearing for adoption. And so with that, if you have any questions, if you need the presentation, I can come back. Otherwise, I'll go over there where I have my notes and can follow along on the agenda.
So I had a question for you. You were talking about single mobile homes on, single manufactured homes on a single lot. Could they also be considered ADUs?
Yes.
So if there's already a house, a stick-built house there, you could put
And
a,
I will distinguish between a manufactured home and a prefab home and an RV. In that sense, RVs would be required to be allowed within manufactured home parks. They are not required under state law to be on single-family properties. So, but if somebody had a prefab or a manufactured home, the state law says that we have to treat them the same way that we would treat a stick-built construction. And so if a single unit is allowed to be built and an ADU is allowed to be built in a conventional sense, then a manufactured home unit qualifies in that same.
okay, thank you. Susan?
And apologies to everyone for being a little bit late. Thank you for that presentation. The consultants are not here because?
I think one of the consultants I believe we have on Zoom, Journey, is here to hear your feedback.
Oh, okay.
Scott had a conflict.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Should we go to public comments first? Okay. I have Rich Rohde has signed up to speak to us about this issue. Okay, come forward, introduce yourself. Not a problem, so are the rest of us.
Rich Rohde, 124 Ohio.
Rich, the button? Could you push the button?
So,
Oh,
yeah,
there we go.
thank you.
Okay, Rich Rohde, 124 Ohio. I'm a former member of the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee for a long time. I'm now part of Southern Oregon Housing for All, which is an organization that's working for affordable housing and for homeless issues, made up of volunteers and advocates. I'm here today to speak as strongly as possibly I can for support for this ordinance because it's had such a long but really excellent history and review. And I think I want to start with, I was part of organizing as a community organizer in 4 of the mobile parks that were closed down over the last decade or so. And I watched as great communities were destroyed by being bought out and set up for other things. And it just is very difficult to do. And what we're doing today is to really preserve standing affordable housing that we have. I want to say that part of the work that was done was an outstanding advisory committee that came together to work, and I was the part of that to really design what we came up with along with the consultants. They did a great job, and so we're really strongly in support of that. I want to say, too, that part of this is, as you know, is in the housing production strategy. So I was part of that, and a lot of people were part of putting together probably the best housing production strategy. It was the first accepted by the state, and it's one of the best in our state for what we have. And the mobile park zoning ordinance was the highest rated of the 9 or 10 strategies that we came up with. And it was scheduled to go in pretty quickly, but the land trusts and the land banks kind of got in ahead of it. But so there's very good reasons for you all to be supporting it because of the history of how it was made. Last point I'll make is that when I was on the Housing Commission, and I think really speaking for everybody that was part of that, that affordable housing was maybe the top goal that we had. And in Ashland, it's difficult. It's very difficult to do that. We're getting better with Sunstone and the Trusted Homes and some others. But when you think of losing perhaps even hundreds of existing homes, and then think how hard and how much money it takes to replace those affordable homes, this is just something that everybody in the city can support wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dolores Nims, would you come forward and introduce yourself?
I'm Dolores Nims. I live at 321 Clay Street, space number 109 in Wingspread Mobile Home Park. We have 116 homes there. They've been there. The park started in the 60s. I've been there 25 years. If I put my double-wide home up for sale, I'd price it about $200,000. I can't move my house. It is not mobile. If a developer came in and bought that property, we are just out of luck. We have lost a major asset. We have a beautiful park. We have 4 ponds full of geese and ducks and goslings now. We have a wonderful community. It would be just tragic if this mobile home was sold to developers and these people had to relocate. We have everything from young families to old people like me. And we need some protection. And that's why we've come to the city to ask us for an ordinance that would provide us some protection. So thank you for listening and being concerned about this.
So can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Do you think the 120 days that's been proposed is enough time?
You're going to have to speak louder, ma'am.
Do you think that the 120 days that is being proposed is enough time for the community to pull together and find a buyer within themselves or a community organization that would take over the land ownership?
I'd like to have 6 months,
Okay,
but it sure beats 30 days.
okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay. Anybody have any questions for staff on what's being proposed?
Yeah, Chair, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering about the proposed notice of sale and tenant rights. There's discussion in our packet about the Bellingham ordinance, and its provision of a 120-day timeline. It also mentions that there's like a 60-day notice period that's in addition to those 120 days. So I wonder if staff could just talk a little bit about how that timeline would work for a tenant organization to try to organize financing for the purchase of a mobile home or manufactured home development in the event of the receipt of a notice of sale from the owner.
So my understanding is that the 120 days includes the 60 days, and that the 60-day period is the period that the owner has to allow or has to provide notice to the tenants that it's for sale, and then has to give them additional time to do the organization. We heard from Rock USA, as Brandon mentioned, and we did ask them what their time frame would be or what their ideal time frame would be. Obviously, a longer time frame would be better, but they said 120 days is sufficient, and that they are able to work with homeowners in parks.
I'm sorry, who said 120 days is sufficient?
Alex Anand from CASA, I'm so sorry, CASA, which is a resident-owned community organization. So he believes that it is enough time to organize community residents and secure financing in models that they have had in the past, experiences that they've had in the past with creating these manufactured home parks that are owned,
And just,
resident-owned.
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just for your information, the commission went on our annual retreat last year. We went to several mobile home parks along in the valley, and one of them was a resident-owned community, and that's where the connection with CASA comes from.
And I think Brandon mentioned as well, and I don't know if you were going to say this, I didn't mean to preempt you, that the Housing and Human Services Committee was also in favor of working to provide education to park owner or park residents about how to prepare for that ownership process and trying to facilitate that relationship and that communication with the organizations that can help facilitate purchasing the park, so that when that time, if that time ever came, not when, they would be more prepared.
So I was just going to provide for the group or anybody listening at home that the proposed code for opportunity to purchase section, and we don't have the section number yet, 030B, states if a qualified tenant organization or other eligible organization, after receiving a notice of sale, wishes to purchase the manufactured home park, it shall submit a proposed purchase and sale agreement in writing via certified or registered mail to the manufactured home park owner within 120 days of receipt of the manufactured home park's owner's notice of sale. So it goes on from there to talk that the owner has to work in good faith, but I think that park owner is required to provide notice under state law to the residents of a notice of sale, and then once received is when that 120-day period would start. And that's why I was talking about the value of working with those resident-owned community organizers early, so that in the event a park owner does look at selling, the park residents would already have a structure in place to respond. Additionally, there would be no prohibition on approaching the owner to purchase the property, and if there's additional funding available through the state for acquisition of manufactured home parks, resident-owned communities do afford probably the greatest protection that the residents of the parks would be looking for. You know, we are talking tonight about establishing zoning code that the parks stay manufactured home parks, but it doesn't have any impact in terms of the increasing cost of space rents, which is outside the land use code. So that's where a resident-owned community could have more impact on that.
Thank you. That's a really important clarification, that the 60-day notice period is a condition of state law, and that the 120-day period that's referenced in this draft ordinance is for the opportunity to respond to such a notice. And that 120 days would be the same whether an existing tenant organization responds or whether such an organization does not yet exist. And the notice of sale is sort of the galvanizing event that gets people even thinking about organizing. And so, given that it's the same in either case, I'm wondering, and in light of the public comment we just heard, asking for a little bit more time, I heard 180 days would be preferred. I'm wondering if we might go just one little extra step better here. And maybe this is a point for deliberation, but yeah, it's just something I wanted to flag because the periods would be the same whether a tenant organization exists or not.
Eric?
Thank you. Brandon, you referenced the number of manufactured homes on the properties, 116 at Wingspread, 51 at Upper Pines. Are those permitted or are those what's there?
Both.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think my point is not all these manufactured home parks are created equal. Some are well laid out and the owners went through the right process to get permits to put these manufactured homes on there. Other ones have just crammed them in there and let people build on unconforming however it has happened over history, and there's been no control over that, even to the point where they're not even zoned for that. Is that what I'm gathering?
Yeah, I'll just call out a couple parks. Wingspread Park, I'm pretty confident that all 116 units
Yeah.
have gone through a
It's
permitting
nice, yeah.
process. And when one is removed, and I remember a time a number of years back when a few were added and they went through a expansion of their park and got those permitted. There is a requirement for a manufactured home permit for installing any manufactured home on any property. You're really looking at things like how it's anchored to the ground, water, sewer, and electric connections. Pretty straightforward permit. There are also parks in which I would say are non-conforming because as RVs or other units were brought in, they may have gone through and connected to city systems through a permitting process, but their additions to the side of those might not have gotten permits. Mm-hmm. And I say might not have, highly likely that they did not. Mm-hmm. So those would be some of the non-conforming situations. I think that the Lower Pines project in the C1 zone is probably an example of that, where you'll see a number of units in there. Upper Pines, thank you. And, however, those still are providing housing for those residents, and so that's where that non-conforming provisions come into play.
And I think I'm getting to my point here is my goal is to protect the residents and the homes that are there. But when Upper Pines goes to swap one out, that would be the time that we say, now wait a minute, like there's all of these code violations that are going on. We want to protect the residents that are there. And if a fire was to start and it's almost structure to structure to structure all the way through there, and we're allowing them to, someone moved out, so that home is already gone. By letting them replace it and not having the appropriate spacing, we're kind of endangering all the other residents there because it's, in my opinion, from what I could see on the outside, it has been a landlord that has wanted to maximize their return on their investment here and just allow as many dense units without regards to open space, quality of living, etc. So I don't want to displace anybody with this, but I think we have an opportunity when you were talking about expansion and code compliance to really identify some of these that this is already a problem we need to address. And I don't know if we can carve out some language that can help us do that, because I do agree. I've been to Wingspread, Tolman, Siskiyou Village, I could see, pretty good parks and well thought out and well maintained. So that's my first question: is how can we protect the residents of ones that carry very high risk of that danger? And then also Jackson Well Springs. Are there any permitted units out there?
That's in Jackson County, so that would
So
not be through our office.
I would discourage us bringing that into as a manufactured home or even identifying it as a manufactured home park. All the properties around there are commercial. It by and large is used as a commercial property. I would like us to not see us bring it in or even identify that it's going to be brought in when it gets annexed in, but allow the owner to apply for that at that time and not give the same protection to the 12 units that are out there for the 16 or 40 acres that this commercial site sits on. But Nauvoo Park, I've been there, and it is a legitimate manufactured home park and well laid out, and I'm so happy it survived the Alameda fire when it went right next door to it. But it's got tall trees, it's got water in the general area, so.
So I think I can address a number of your questions, but I think you're right. A lot of that is for deliberation with this body. The removing an existing unit from Upper Pines and bringing a new unit in would require a manufactured home install permit. And as part of that permit process, the building division and the fire division would review that install for compliance for that. And that's true today, regardless of this code adoption. This code adoption would still allow that one unit to come out and a new unit to replace it without bringing the entirety of the site into compliance. Again, if that's the section on nonconformities, that would institutionalize that. And that's really for if they wanted to add units, not that I believe there's any additional space on that park to do it. But if they wanted to remodel in some way, or, again, we're not proposing at staff that become a manufactured home park zone, that it stay C1 and CFA because of the greater development potential on that particular property. But to use the other parks as examples, if they were to remove a unit from Tolman Creek and bring a new unit in, we would not reevaluate the entirety of the site for coming into compliance. We just make sure that that existing unit that was removed, the unit that replaces it, meets the setback from the perimeter of the property and meets building and fire code for installation.
So can
Yeah.
I ask a question? So then, if they removed what's classified as a single wide right now, and it didn't meet the setbacks, we might maybe only allow an RV that's shorter into that space, because is that what you're saying? So,
Or a prefab or a manufactured home that's shorter.
shorter, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think those all do meet setbacks, but.
Okay.
That's,
And then I missed that on your proposed zoning. So that one Upper Pines, the proposed zoning would not be in HP at this point.
Correct, but it would still be considered a manufactured home development park, and as such be subject to the allowances for its non-conforming uses going forward. It just wouldn't have the zone that would only allow manufactured home units in the future going forward. Because it's in the CFA, if the property owner did, want to redevelop the site, they wouldn't be limited to manufactured home park use. So,
And what about the Jackson Wells?
Jackson Well Springs, that's probably for deliberation when you're talking about the comprehensive plan amendment, because it's not in the city. It wouldn't be assigned that zone. We were looking at, really seeding our comprehensive plan to anticipate those parks coming in as a manufactured home park zone when they do come in. But again, if this body wanted to recommend that one not be included on the comp plan map, it would stay a manufactured home park in the county until such time an annexation.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if that's true about Upper Pines, or if that's the way it is at Upper Pines, what are the protections for those residents if the owner decides to sell the property.
They development pressure for commercialization of that property would continue to exist on that.
So there is.
They'd still have the protections here
But they couldn't form a,
Resident
theoretically they could and then
but they
purchase
wouldn't
the
be
property.
able to purchase the property because of the value of it. So there's not
Right.
the same protections, and it's not being proposed.
Correct, and I think that's part and parcel of the distinction, just to get into a little bit of land use. The concern over the value of the property for its underlying uses, a residentially zoned property with a manufactured home park with increased density does have somewhat commensurate values. I think the Upper Pines with a C1 that allows 5 stories and commercial ground floor and residential could have a higher use, and looks like Commissioner Mahar might have other concerns.
Thanks, Brandon. And thank you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you, Linda, also for all the work that you did with the subcommittee, which I sat on. I think, just to follow up on Brandon's point, I think it's worth punctuating that the Upper Pines will have to be exempt. I mean, it is what it is. It's C1, CFA. And there's just, that is what it is. And I think there are other opportunities for the city to support residents that will be impacted by the natural market forces that Brandon has articulated. But, what we're going to see is we will eventually see a point at which the vacancy, the cost of vacancy of the pads and the relocation costs will be less than the future value of redevelopment for mixed-use development. And that will be up to Ron. And Ron will make the decision when he so chooses. But pad rents, to my knowledge, have not gone up in many years there. So it may remain, or it may be redeveloped, but I think it's safe to say that it's outside the scope of this effort.
So as the code, as there is an effect on that existing site, because it's going to become more, if as units leave, if they're being held to new standards, it will become more expensive or less profitable potentially to run it the way it is. So the whole thing forces itself to ultimately not be worth having a park in. And I'm not advocating that we should do anything. I'm just making myself aware of it, I guess. So that those people that live there, there is a horizon for them. That's all. And it's kind of unavoidable. And this code change doesn't help. It actually makes it worse.
Well, I think those conditions exist now, those
Yeah.
pressures, because the property is zoned that way.
Right.
What this code does is it establishes 2 things that I would see as protections for the residents. One, because it's an established manufactured home park, it would be subject to those manufactured home park notice of sale, opportunity to purchase, and relocation standards. It also would be afforded the opportunity to look at the non-conforming conditional use permit so that marginal improvements to the park could be done without it being cost prohibitive, in the sense that the park owner would have to upgrade the entirety of the site. So those are 2 aspects that afford new protections to that park that don't currently exist. But I think the development pressure that you're recognizing is true.
Susan?
I'd like to go back to the 120-day timeframe, because reflecting some of what we've already heard here and just practical realities of well-organized, well-funded organizations versus a bunch of homeowners. Do we think, I heard mention of one case where the 120 came from, but do we really believe that that's adequate? I just went through a traditional mortgage process, and I own multiple properties, and it still took me 60 days. And so 120 doesn't seem like a lot in that regard when you have to organize to start with, let alone find a way of working your way through this. So do we believe that's adequate? Do we believe it's a best practice? Because if we effected one thing here, it seems to me that that's a key control point, that, again, not to be obstructive to, to broader forces and the overall economic, health of the community, but looking out for these naturally more affordable housing that we all see, I think, as being valuable. Are we doing enough there with 120 days?
So we're at a point where we are offering comments back to the consultants, and if they hear enough of us comment that something longer than 120 days might be reasonable, then I would think that they would, being good consultants, that they would take that and put that in the draft that comes back to us at the end of May. So I think.
I expect she's hearing us. I see you're there on the Zoom, so.
And I'll add my voice. I think 180 days might be better to look at than 120 days, more reasonable for people to organize and get going and wade through the financial market.
Chair.
Sure.
From what I heard, it was 120 days to prepare a sale agreement and turn it into the landlord, to the home, the manufactured home park owner.
Yeah.
And then from that point, that person is then to negotiate in good faith with that contract. So that contract doesn't get executed on the day that you turn it in. You lay out some guidelines on financing, timeline, some due diligence. I mean, you've lived there for 6 months, or for years. So, I mean, you would know some of that. And I'm not saying either way, but that's what I heard is that's the time to get a sale agreement in. Most commercial sale agreements last 90 days after that. Most residentials only last 30 days after that, till you execute.
something
Yeah.
or-
So I was just throwing that out there in the whole calculation. On timeline, if you do 180, it might be almost a year before it closes, and I'm not saying that that's not the right answer. I'm just trying to outlay
That's
the
good. No,
timeline.
that's good.
Is that what the state?
Yes, I think
Guidelines said that.
it's to provide an offer, and the resident-owned community organizing nonprofit, they were looking at 120 days as opposed to the state mandated period as being so short. So they were favorable to the 120. I would presume that a longer period would be of benefit to the resident-owned community organizing group. In terms of best practice, we don't have any models to look at other than Bellingham. No city in Oregon currently implements anything along these lines. So.
Okay, but thanks for Eric for pointing out that we don't have to get a timeline that includes completion of the sale.
Yeah, I mean, usually the sale agreement will be predicated on like it's a bank-backed support letter that they would support it, but they are not necessarily guaranteeing the loan at that point. And the buyers would still be shopping for a loan or finding a way to get the money pulled together with a timeline on there.
Okay.
And likely some earnest money that would lock it down, to show that they're serious and not just wasting
Everybody's
time.
Yeah.
So, because that could be a really long. A seller would lose a deal if it went longer than 6 months. Like that, the buyer is probably going to leave at that point,
Okay.
And so I guess I would, probably back to the consultant, talk to counsel. Is that going to put us in legal jeopardy of putting a burden on someone that wouldn't be necessary? And I don't know. I don't know that answer, and I don't know what the nonprofit groups, if they came up with 120 days, did they feel good with that number, or were they like, well, we really wanted 180 and we settled for 120, or they were good for 120? And if they're good for 120, they're the pros, I guess.
Right, I mean, I guess that was kind of my thought about the best practice, is that we only really heard from one nonprofit that does this, and that was the information that they shared with us. And it is about organizing the residents, because I believe it's 51% of the residents have to agree, and then they have to crunch the numbers to know, if we do buy this park, what will your new space rents be? Can you afford that realistically? So, I mean, they have to know all of that information going in, and he felt that 21 day or 120 days was sufficient.
Yeah, I think they are also looking at that same 120-day period to do some due diligence in terms of what infrastructure costs might be for improvements that would have to be absorbed by the new resident-owned community, and how that would factor. So they do have to do a bit of legwork to establish, as well as get 51% of the residents to agree. So it may be that within 120 days, they know whether they'll have a majority of residents or not, and what financing mechanisms they would have. But
And they do have special organizations that finance the purchase of parks, so it's not like they're trying to secure bank loans. They're securing loans through other, like, nonprofit organizations that are specifically lending to purchase parks in this model.
Has there been a park purchased by just the residents without a nonprofit third party that you know of? Like, I mean, it would seem like quite an undertaking to provide that third party and get everyone to be on the same page.
It looks like John may have. I don't know of any that have done that.
No, I don't know if they had like nonprofit assistance. I think they probably they provided technical advisory support from CASA, which is the nonprofit out of Sherwood, and they run something called the Manufactured Housing Cooperative. Here, I'll give it to you. Manufactured Housing Cooperative Development Center, and that's exactly what they do, is they get involved and help them assess what the infrastructure costs are, what's the pathway to ownership, how do we secure financing. Big piece of it is the board. You have to put a board together, it's all the incorporation. So that's what they do. And we were fortunate that Anand, who is a director there, spoke to the subcommittee. So it's a small number of parks here in Ashland. So it's going to be a lift, but I mean, it's something that the city can support, and I think Brandon spoke about it very eloquently. I just want to follow up. I don't want to lose sight of all the good work that the consultants did, the subcommittee did. I think it's worth pointing out that particularly the conditional use permit and the pathway to compliance for bringing sites into at least partial compliance and then developing, units through hardship exception to meet code standards eventually is it's going to be a huge improvement. And I would also say that the density and lot standards changes that they introduced are going to potentially offer an opportunity for some parks to bring in new types of housing, which Brandon spoke about, new models of housing, new modular, more density. Because my understanding today is that mostly you have this pathway where units that are end of life can go through one or two refurbished cycles, potentially be resold or released, but ultimately will be replaced with RVs. And so some of these parks, certainly Upper Pines, will increasingly be populated with RVs over time. And that's, not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something to recognize, I think, here. And being able to bring in more modular might provide more diversity of housing in those places.
Susan?
So slightly different question. Is there an understanding what best practices are in terms of the type of ownership structure that works in cases of owners taking ownership? I lived through an experience, for example, where privately owned apartments were turned into co-ops. And it took more than a year. Just sharing that experience. But co-ops, it turns out, were a really flawed form of ownership because they didn't work well at all in the Boston environment where I was right there. So that was quite a while ago. Is there a sense of what's the best today? What the best alternatives are? And again, this may be beyond the Planning Commission, but as part of this overall initiative, sort of help to pave the way towards best solutions if they need to be found?
I don't think that we're aware of any other solutions aside from like a cooperatively owned, resident-owned park. I haven't heard of any other options because I think, as John pointed out in a memo that you wrote, when the owners are not in control of the land, they really have no control over how the rents are changed and the amenities that are offered or not maintained, and those sorts of costs, how they bear the burden of those costs disproportionately. I think there have been a lot of resident-owned cooperative parks throughout the nation that have done well, and I think I can't remember, Derek, I don't know if you remember, we attended a Zoom meeting about the success of those types of parks. I think it has worked well for the residents. It has provided them with the security that they've needed in those circumstances, at least that's what we've heard. But I don't know of any others, so I would defer to anyone else who might.
Yeah, I think you're right in your assessment that that's outside of land use, and as such, we're probably not the best to answer the question of other models. We do know that a number of manufactured home parks throughout the country have been purchased by investors that then look at the increasing rents as a way to monetize. And so resident-owned communities are a counter to that. Perhaps there's other options, but not that I'm aware.
I would just say I think nonprofit ownership probably is the other option, right? Where you get a nonprofit that comes in and buys it. Yeah. Right.
That is a local example. Thank you. The Housing Authority of Jackson County purchased a local manufactured home park after it was destroyed in the Alameda fire and have rebuilt it under
Royal Oaks.
Royal Oaks that we visited. So that's a good model.
There's actually an organization in Oregon, Network for Oregon Affordable Housing, NOAA, and they provide loans specifically for nonprofits that are buying manufactured housing parks. So there's kind of I'd say a system or infrastructure in place for that here in the state.
What was the one in town was that nonprofit?
So that was a resident-owned community.
That was the one in town that got rebuilt back?
Yeah, what is it called? Town Global Space?
I believe so.
And CASA was the organization that helped them formulate a board and develop their own resident-owned community.
Okay, are there any questions on the particulars that are in the ordinance about street widths, fire regulations? Go for it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. A question about the non-conforming piece that has been mentioned a few times already. The phase compliance and review criteria seem pretty straightforward. I just want to ask a clarifying question about the criteria. In a couple of different places, there are different phrases of slightly different meaning that seem to mean the same thing. I just want to ask if that's intentional. So on page 20 of this matrix document is what I'm referring to, and under on the very right-hand column, updated code text, number 2 at the top of page 20 regarding no non-conforming manufactured housing development shall be enlarged is the beginning of that, right? Under sub-item A, next paragraph down, the last 3 words of that is demonstrable financial hardship, right? So that's the criteria for hardship, demonstrable financial hardship. I'm wondering if that means the same thing as in the next subsection, B 3, documented financial burden. Are they intended to mean the same thing? Is there an intentional difference between those? How will those be evaluated from review to review? And is there a non-discriminatory standard that we could apply that would ensure fairness of reviews of proposals to bring non-conforming MHDs into compliance?
I'd probably look to you for any guidance if you see ways to streamline that. I do think that the intention is that the sections, Section B, the review criteria, are in an effort for the decision-making body to have an evaluation in order to make a finding that the full compliance would result in a demonstrable financial hardship. And so if those criteria could be worded in such a way that you feel allows for that assessment in a more equitable fashion, I think, as you put it, we're open to those recommendations.
Okay, thank you. That totally answers my question about, whether it was intentional or not. And it occurs to me that maybe just using the same phrase in both places would remedy my confusion about it. And perhaps somewhere in the glossary, like a definition of demonstrable financial hardship, could be helpful. So there's fair notice, for due process purposes.
And I guess what I've always wondered, is it the financial hardship does that translate to the residents, or is that about the owner? I mean, it could be either or
Seems to
both.
apply to the owner here, right?
Yeah, I think an owner could make an argument that in order to facilitate the improvements needed to come into full compliance, their only recourse would be to raise rents in order to offset those capital improvements. They may be able to make that argument to a decision-making body that is a financial burden or hardship that could be avoided with a partial improvement.
I'm really glad you mentioned financing of improvements, because that leads to the second clarifying question that I have about this same section, and then I'll be done.
No, go for it.
The subsection C, now we're in the middle of page 21 on that same column, under the heading limitations. Everybody follow? It's 2C, limitations, under the phase compliance and review criteria. All right, so the first limitation is approval under the subsection for phased compliance of non-conforming MHDs shall not allow an increase in the number of manufactured housing spaces beyond what legally existed at the time the development became non-conforming. And I'm wondering if there's a world, like say hypothetically, if Upper Pines was bigger and had a slightly different circumstance, and the owner determined that it was more efficient to redevelop with a slightly greater density of spaces, say the kind of duplex tiny houses that were discussed. Could this prohibition, this limitation on an increase in the number of spaces beyond what existed at the time of nonconformance, could that defeat efficient redevelopment in order to bring an MHD into compliance?
I think so. So I think that's a good catch. I think if the intention is to allow for the potential of a park that is less than the maximum density for a manufactured home park, they are conforming in terms of density. Should they be allowed to add units in order to increase the density of that park? Correct me if I'm reframing it incorrectly, but.
I'm just pitching a hypothetical.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that hypothetical and I'm visualizing a circumstance in which a park I'm just going to use round numbers, 10 units per acre wants to add 2 units per acre and get up to 12 units per acre, still less than the 18 units, but it's non-conforming in some other fashion in terms of setbacks, for instance. Should they be allowed to expand the number of units and ensure that the additional units meet current requirements, but not necessarily retroactively address the others?
Yeah.
And my read of that right now is no, they'd not be permitted because it is prohibiting an increase in the number of units.
Right. So you totally see my point.
I do, and I
It could
think-
be inefficient to bifurcate those two things, bringing a place into conformance and accomplishing, efficient redevelopment. If they can be done simultaneously, why wouldn't we afford an owner the flexibility to do
Yeah.
that?
I think that makes sense, and that's something, again, if the commission wants us to take a look at that further, Housing and Human Services has already reviewed this code, and that committee had recommended the code go forward without changes, but we didn't discuss this particular issue at that body. So I think that is a good catch and one that we should talk with our consultants about and see if we could come back.
So just to clarify, would that cover the circumstance where perhaps the incremental units could help to provide the financial justification for a widening road, and that's going to cost you X dollars? And so you're saying, why separate those things? Just allow them to do both at the same time, apply for the non-conforming conditional use permit or whatever to widen the roads, and also at the same time add the units because they're sort of essentially tied in the same business model.
Yeah,
Okay, got
kill
it.
both birds
Yeah, yeah.
with one stone.
Okay.
And you're not spending money on two separate
Yeah,
processes.
I got it, thanks.
And the conditional use permit process affords the city an opportunity to review the proposal and weigh the merits of it. So additional units may not be problematic in a particular case in exacerbating a nonconformity. On the other hand, if those units being added were outside the reach of fire hydrants, you'd want to address that nonconformity.
Yeah, either way, you would have the opportunity to consider all that together. It saves everybody a lot of time.
So Brandon, when you were making your presentation, you went down through a lot of suggestions on things we might want to change. Do you want us to go to address those?
Yeah, the, staff recommendation on, again, we've talked a lot about the development code that relates to the design standards for manufactured home parks. The zoning designation for manufactured home parks. Currently, there is a question in terms of Upper Pines, in terms of its ultimate zoning that would be presented in the ordinance and the zoning map. So a recommendation on that. Additionally, the draft code before you has one of the design standards of 50% of the unbuilt area as must be landscaped. From staff's perspective, that is incongruent with other
Parts of the code.
other standards. And so our recommendation is to look at 65% lot coverage, 35% landscaping for any manufactured home park zone to equalize them all.
Okay, let's stop there because
Those are the two.
two is what I can remember.
Yeah.
So what do we think about those two changes as
I would-
proposed by staff?
I would think the 3565 is appropriate since it matches
A zoning.
other zones.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Consensus on that? Okay. And the second one was landscaping and,
Oh, that
Yeah,
is
that
the
was
landscaping.
landscaping.
The second one is the zoning application
for
to various
keeping-
properties, and I'll add to it Commissioner Herron's comment about the comp plan zoning for the wing spread is, pardon me? Wellspring, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think
Well
we
Springs
should bring
belongs in.
Wellspring. It's 12 units, there's probably 30 campsites, it's on 25 acres, like I just.
It's a
don't
long
feel
way
like
away.
It meets the intention at this point.
It's
Okay.
something else.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Just to be clear, that's not even under consideration, right? They're not applying for annexation, so
No.
it's not even,
Yeah.
it's,
But if we identify now that that's what it's gonna be when it annex in, it comes in,
okay.
whenever they go
All right.
to get in, so maybe they need sewer and water and this
They
is,
do.
get annexed in, and then we say, okay, you're manufactured home park.
Yeah, I don't think that it should be brought in either.
So just one clarification on the 65-35. How much of a departure from current reality is that? Do we know? I mean, is it a huge stretch or?
At
In
the
the
mobile home
existing
parks
park?
or in the general,
It's
R2.
current zoning.
If we, huh?
It's current zoning now.
Right. If we apply it to mobile home parks, how much of a change or is it?
they don't have to upgrade to it, it's only if they create changes, right? So
Yeah, I would assume most of the manufactured home parks currently comply with that
Okay, that was
requirement.
my question.
Um,
Is it asking for a radical change or not? Probably.
You know, again, that's like wing spread, for example. That's currently the requirement in wing spread.
Okay.
Is 65-35, but I believe that they probably have in excess of 35% landscaping. So, yeah. And Nauvoo. Yeah.
Okay, 2 down. Any more to go? Street standards, street,
Yeah, again, the staff is comfortable with the street standards presented in the draft code. We did talk with the fire marshal about those and felt that the existing parks, you know, may not meet those standards in all cases, but that the fire marshal would work around the existing parks for redevelopment, but looking at the standards that we proposed would largely be adequate. Derek, you may recall that conversation. Okay. Yeah, so I think that we don't have any alternative recommendation on streets.
okay. Okay, then I'll take the big leap and say those are our comments. Okay, so we can move on to the next item, which is open discussion. Anybody have anything to discuss? Eric?
I got a nasty email that I haven't finished my ethics thing, so make sure
Don't
you got
forget
your,
that.
make sure you got your ethics report turned in.
Yeah, they'll fine you. $50 a day. Didn't you do that before?
I missed by one day, but they didn't charge me the 10 for the record. Harder to collect than it's worth.
Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
I have a quick question for open discussion, if I could.
Sure.
Is there any update on the ODOT contract status for transportation plan revision?
I don't have an update for you on that. I know I was supposed to have one, so I'll make a note to talk to Scott.
I'll just keep squeaking over that.
Okay,
Based on discussion with the other commission heads on Friday, I believe the answer is no.
okay,
Informal meeting that takes place once a month.
so we're just gonna wait. Okay, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Okay, all those opposed? No. We are adjourned.